My name is Jean Ellis. Join me as I and my family lived through the Second World War in Hull, one of the most bombed out areas in England. I became a child of war.
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you the following announcement.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
My sister Jean died earlier this year, and amongst her happy memories was an untold story. A story about evacuation during the Second World War. The story involves my sister Jean, sister Mary, and brother Tommy. I was yet to be born. During this story, I shall be narrating the part of my father and the other people that Jean came in contact with. Jean was an inquisitive girl and liked to question things. And my story begins with a question.
What is the meaning of the word evacuation? This was a new one to me. Evacuation. The teacher in class told us we were all to be evacuated, but didn't explain what that meant. I asked Dad, and he explained it to my sister Mary, my brother Tommy, and myself.
Well, Jean, it means going from a dangerous place to a safe place, away from the bombs that are expected to be dropped on the port of Hull. Me and your mum, we can't come with you. As a policeman, I have to stay here and do my duty, and your mum has to do war work in place of all the men who have had to go to war.
My mum got work at Hesk's, a corn and straw merchant who dealt with the farmers.
They get up in the morning and they rise and shine. You'll find them on the buses or the trams. They're digging your potatoes, assembling mines. They're fixing up your plumbing and they're driving vans. They're the working girls, and the hours are long, and the noise of the factory drowns out their song. It's a lonely life when the man's away, and the job in the factory help them work the day. They called up in the Air Force or the ATS. They're manning guns and packing parachutes. They must be quite attractive in their battle dress, 'cause the local fellas always call them cute. They're serving girls on an army camp, and the barracks are cold and the walls are damp. Their heads are high and they're doing their bit for the sake of the country, and they're proud of it. They're delivering your letters to the right address. They're cleaning windows and they're felling trees. You'll see them after air raids with the WVS, comforting the wounded and then serving teas. They're working girls when the war is through. They'll keep their freedom and the money too. Get used to the sights and get used to the view of the working girls by the side of you.
Evacuation day came, and all of the evacuees had to report to school, where the buses were waiting to take us on our journey. We were told,
You will take a bus to the pier. There you will take the ferry to Lincolnshire, where you will be put on a train to your final destination.
well, to me it seemed like a big adventure. In the school hall, we were issued with our names written on a piece of cardboard threaded with string, which was put around our necks, just like a parcel.
You will not remove it until you are with the people you are staying with. Here's a brown paper bag with some food in it, food and fish and fruit, etc. Please give those to the people you will be staying with.
We also had our gas masks, which we had to carry with us wherever we went.
Young lady, your parents will bring your clothes to you when they know where you will be staying. This will give them a chance to meet the people you are staying with and to view the accommodation.
As we were getting on the bus to start our journey, I overheard a mother who was waving goodbye to her child say to another mother, "Like lambs to the slaughter." I marched up to my teacher and demanded to be taken off that bus, and to my sister, who had been put on another bus, because I said, "We're not going to any slaughterhouse." I knew about slaughterhouses because there was one in the street next to ours. And although it was strictly forbidden, we used to sneak off and see the animals taken in and slaughtered until we were spotted by one of the men who worked there, who chased us off.
Get out of here!
The teacher explained that what I overheard was just a saying that adults used and didn't mean we were to be slaughtered. Well, I believed her. She was the teacher after all. We were all ready to begin our adventure. We arrived at the pierhead ready to board the ferry, something none of us had ever done before. We were herded into groups according to age and were told to stay in our groups and keep with our teachers and threaten not to move from them. This meant I never saw my sister to speak to, as she was in an older group. After we disembarked from the ferry, we were taken by train or bus, I can't remember which, to a town I think was Boston, where we were taken into a building which could have been a church hall, and we were given a drink and a sandwich. We were allowed to visit the toilet, but still remained in our groups. In a little while, allocations took place. The youngest group, mine, was first. I'd hoped I'd see Mary before I went, but she was in the second group. There were 3 ladies sitting at a desk, dressed in dark blue uniforms. They would call out our names one at a time, and we would be taken up to the desk and our name would be recorded. My name and age were written down, and I was told to go back to the side of the hall and stand in line. When everyone was recorded and accounted for, a door opened, and in came the people who were to be responsible for us to choose an evacuee to take. The lady who chose me was called Mrs. Wright. She was young and married, with a baby aged 2 called John. Oh, her husband stuttered, and I used to watch and listen to him speak, fascinated. Mrs. Wright told me they lived at Fosdyke. Oh, it was a lovely place. Countryside at one side and the wash at the other. It was a small holding and they kept vegetable trees, fruit gardens and pigs, chickens and geese. Next door to the bungalow lived an elder lady we called Gran, who looked after the young ones whilst their parents were at work.
Again, don't know where, don't know when, but I know we'll meet again some sunny day. Keep smiling through, just like you always do, till the blue skies drive the dark clouds.
School was next on the agenda. Auntie explained that she would take me to school on the Thursday and get me enrolled, and after that I'd have to go by myself and find my own way, because her and uncle worked for the local landowner on a farm. School was a mile or so away from my new home.
There was a large hall and just one large classroom where boys and girls of various ages were taught together. There was a lot of friction between the local boys and girls and the evacuees, and fights broke out between them. As the friction got worse, the teachers came up with the idea of the children choosing an evacuee to befriend and protect. That evacuee was his responsibility.
It worked well and eased tension, so it was a good idea. But the classroom was divided down the middle, the locals on one side and evacuees at the other. Not such a good idea. Despite this, and the fact that when it came to school nativity plays and other productions, all of the locals would be given the main parts and the evacuees formed the choir at the back. It was a happy school. When I'd been at Auntie's a week, Mum and Dad came to visit.
We brought you clothes and news of Mary. She's staying with a nice young couple who have a business delivering biscuits. She's living at a place called Frampton. Yes, it's a little village not far from a place called Fosdyke, maybe distance-wise like Hull is to Headon.
Yet, I was not to see her for a year. Despite this, I loved living at Fosdyke. It taught me to appreciate the countryside, birds and the animals. I'd never seen countryside before, and until I lived there, had only ever played in the back streets of Hull. Every Saturday morning, Auntie would clean the bungalow, and to get me out of the way, she would give me a small bucket and send me down to the wash to wait for the shrimp boat to land. A lot of my school friends would be there too with their buckets, and we would collect shrimps and take them home for dinner. Next door to the school was a church, which I attended every Sunday. I was in the choir, as were half the class. During the school holidays, I helped accompany an auntie and uncle to the local farm where they worked. We did odd little jobs and played in the fields. The owner, who I think was a squire, lived in the manor house with his servants. He owned many farms in the area, and most of the locals worked for him. At Christmas, he would give a big party for all of his workers and their families. I went and received a Christmas present from under the tree.
After a year when the bombing in Hull had not reached its peak, it was decided to bring the children home. How wrong we were.
So Dad was to bring us home. It was arranged for me to join up with Mary in Frampton so he could collect us both together. I was so excited to be seeing my sister again and to see where she'd been living. I went on a Friday morning. Auntie packed my belongings and took me to the bus stop and told the conductor to see me off the bus at Frampton. I was met at the bus stop by a teacher who then took me to my sister's house. This was no house, but a large mansion. There were 4 teachers and 7 evacuees living there. It was massive. I don't remember seeing the lord or lady of the house, and it was the teachers who looked after the evacuees. Dad came for us on Sunday, so I spent 2 nights there. The only person I remember seeing who belonged to the house was an old man who was very religious. He was very deaf, so we used to laugh and talk behind his back, as children do. I enjoyed being there for 2 days. Mum came to collect us, whilst Dad went to collect my brother Tom from Hornsea. I'd not seen him for a year. He'd been evacuated to Hornsea as he was an infant, just 4 years old. I have to say, at 6 years old, my memory was acute, and I remember learning lots of things during my evacuation at Fosdyke. I remember learning how to tell the time and learning about the festivals of Easter, Whit and Harvest Festival. I remember learning hymns of the season, Christmas carols, We wish you a Merry Christmas, we wish you a Merry Christmas, and dancing around the maypole. And even today, certain festival hymns still bring back memories of that time. On the whole, I was very content. This is the story of my first evacuation, exactly as I remember it.
Returning to Hull was not the end of Jean's evacuation story, because the bombing on Hull was to get worse, and she was to be evacuated on 2 more occasions. The danger in Hull was increasing, and as the bombing campaign was stepped up, it was once again deemed necessary to move children to a place of safety. This evacuation was not through the school. I think it was arranged by the Education Department.
I can't remember how we got there, but we arrived at South Kirkby, Mary, Tommy and I, with our ration books, identity cards and instructions from our mam not to be separated as we had been on our previous evacuation. There were lots of children waiting to be placed from different parts of the country, London, Liverpool and Manchester. I remember it being very noisy, with a lot of the young ones crying to go home, including my brother Tom. People were filing into the hall to choose their evacuees, but time was passing and we hadn't been chosen. Nobody, it seemed, wanted to take on 3 children. Then we were the only 3 left and the authorities were getting desperate. They told us no one would take us and we would have to be separated. They told a lady to take us round the streets of South Kirkby and knock on doors and ask the occupants to take one of us in. For various reasons, nobody wanted us that night and we were told to come back the next day. The lady took us back to the hall, only to find it had been locked up. She didn't know what to do with us, so she took us to the police station.
It's not our problem, love. No, not at all. It's not our responsibility. We can't have 3 children locked up in the jail overnight. No, they can have a cup of cocoa and a biscuit and a blanket each.
We ended up sleeping in a graveyard that night. Eventually, morning came and we were taken around the streets once more. After knocking on several doors, a lady took me in, but only after being reassured that I did not wet the bed or have nits. She took a careful look through my hair to find it was clean and accepted me, but I'd no idea when my sister or brother would be taken. The lady was called Mrs. Rylott, and her husband was a miner, as were all the men in that area. As before, I was to call them auntie and uncle. They had one daughter, called Shirley, who was spoilt and spiteful. Her mother dressed her in the style of the child star Shirley Temple and put her hair in rags every night. On the good ship, Lollipop. She and I shared a double bed, which was comfortable, except when Shirley kept pinching me. I'd been at Auntie's a few months when I realised she did not want me there. She kept asking if I wanted to go home. The reason for this, I think, was because she became friends with the lady billeting officer who visited now and again. It got to a point that she was visiting every day and going shopping with Auntie. Apparently, the officer wasn't happy with where she was living and wanted to move in with Auntie's blessing, of course. Uncle got to hear about this plan and an argument erupted between them. He said,
There's no way I'm turning a child out for an adult who can look after herself.
So at least I had him on my side. I remained there for 9 months and circumstances didn't get much better. I was not very happy. Mam came to collect me whilst my dad went for my sister and brother, and I was to meet them at the bus stop. I hadn't seen them for 9 months either. Nobody had seemed to know where they were.
Down in our back garden where the roses used to be, underneath a pile of loam, we'll find a home from home, just corrugated iron, but it's bolted carefully with concrete at your feet. Our castle is complete. Down in the Anderson shelter, you'll find the family. When the siren sings his song, that's the place where we belong. It gets a little bit congested, but what the heck say we? 'Cause down in our Anderson shelter, we're safe as safe can be. Down in our Anderson shelter, there's just one misery. Well, the floor lets in the rain, and we haven't got a drain. What's a little bit of moisture compared to security? 'Cause down in our Anderson shelter, we're safe as safe can be. When Jean arrived home, she was surprised to see the devastation caused by the bombing. There were churches, shops, pubs, all blitzed down with bomb craters all over the place. Every night, buzzers and sirens went, and most people crowding into the shelters for safety. They were safe unless they got a direct hit. Then they were all killed.
Mum wouldn't go in the shelters. She said they were cold, smelly and dirty, so we stayed in the house. She did out the cupboard under the stairs and put a mattress down for us three to sleep on, and she sat on a cushion on the electric meter. That wasn't until a bomb fell through the kitchen and the roof came down and the windows were smashed.
The air raid wardens are always about putting incendiary bombs out and looking for people who had been bombed. They dug us out. I helped as I was in the vicinity. I was never with them during the Blitz, for as soon as the sirens went, I had to do my duty. I had to get out of bed and help dig the people out of the bombed houses and put the fires out and attend to the injured.
He always managed to find a way to see that we were all right. Anyway, after our house was hit, we were of course homeless and were boarded out with different families in the street.
But at least we managed to see each other every day and in the shelter during the night. Mum and I found us a home in the next street. At the bottom of the street was a factory called
Reckitt's.
situated only a few houses from where we lived. Reckitt's opened its warehouse to anyone who needed refuge during the Blitz. So we went there. With it being so spacious, the children had a good time chasing each other around the pallets. That soon ended, however, when Reckitt's itself was hit and set on fire. Because our houses were so near the factory, we all had to leave our homes.
With all of these disruptions to our lives, we still had to attend school every day, whether we'd been up all night or not. It was sad to hear the next day of school friends who had been killed during the air raids. The headmaster would read out their names in assembly and we'd all say a prayer for them. Another thing we had to get used to was the blackout. Every household had blackout curtains. It was important not to have even a tiny chink of light showing, and if the wardens saw any, they would bang on the door and shout,
"Put that light out!" It was pitch black in the streets, and everywhere we went, we had to have a torch to show the way. The bombing was getting worse in Hull, and for our safety and survival, I decided it was time for another evacuation.
We were on the move again, but this time it was to relatives, a distant cousin of my dad. The place was called South Elmsall. We arrived there wondering what would be in store for us this time, but we had no need to be worried. Auntie and Uncle this time were very nice people. Uncle was a big man who had retired from the pit. His hands were embedded with coal dust and were also scarred. He was a gentleman and really loved children. He was very funny and played out with us on the green. Auntie was also very kind and gave all she could to our welfare. She managed well on the rations we were allowed, because of course we had our ration books, identity cards and our gas masks.
Mr. Hitler, if you think we're on the run. We are the boys who will stop your little game. We are the boys who will make you think again.
was in the Home Guard, Dad's army, and played in the brass band. Every colliery had a band and they competed against each other. Every now and then, Uncle would bring home a large bar of chocolate, something that was like gold dust at that time. Auntie would give us each one square every day whilst it lasted. It was a happy time, and we were made to feel very welcome and part of the community. Auntie found the upheaval of having 3 children to care for too much. All the extra washing, cooking and balancing the rations was hard work. There was no bathroom. Even at home in Hull we had no bathroom. The bath, a tin one, had to be brought in from the yard and a copper had to be filled using buckets of water and then put on to heat. When the 3 of us were bathed, Auntie would then have to empty the bath by throwing the buckets of water outside. She found this very tiring and found she could no longer cope. Mum and Dad came to collect us and told us,
"You're not going home to Hull, you're going to Hunslet to stay with your grandma and granddad." Grandma and granddad lived in Pepper Street, a long street that was adjacent to Pepper Road. To reach the door of Grandma's house, you had to climb up 12 steps from the path, to the left of which was the outside toilet. There were 8 steps down to the toilet, which was shared with the house next door. A coal chute was situated above the steps, and the coalman would tip the coal down the chute to the cellar below. Everything was done in the kitchen. Cooking, eating, playing, sitting. The cooking was done in a large black fire oven. There was no electricity or gas, and the fire was kept going in winter and summer. In the back kitchen was a large stone sink with just one cold water tap, a copper in which to heat water for washing clothes and bathing, and a dolly tub and dolly stick. Grandad also kept a few gardening tools, which he used in his herb garden, situated to the right of the path outside.
Mrs. Next Door cleaned the toilet every day, perhaps because she was much younger than Grandma, and kept it scrupulously clean and smelling of disinfectant. It was an earth closet with 2 containers set beneath a long wooden seat with 2 holes to sit over. She kept this wooden seat scrubbed white every day. She also swilled the steps, come rain or shine. She did this very early in the morning, probably because her husband and 2 teenage sons worked down the mines, so she would have to get up early and see them off to work.
Our grandparents had 3 sons, my dad, who was a policeman, Uncle Lewis, who was a miner, and Uncle Richard, who was in the army. Uncle Lewis was married with a young family. Grandma was the street and district's midwife. Although she had no formal training, it was just accepted that she knew what to do. Her medicines were herbs supplied by Grandad. Grandma was also sent for when anyone died, to wash and lay out the body and dress it in clothes provided for the burial. Grandad had retired from paid employment and earned money from busking. He played the concertina, the crowds outside the cinemas or theatres in the evening. He did this for money, but mostly because he loved the music. Grandad was also a herbalist who made medicines and salves for many ailments. He collected herbs on his walks in the beautiful countryside around Hunslet and took us with him on the weekends or school holidays. People did not generally send for a doctor, as there was only one in the district, an old man who had volunteered to go to the front, where he was most needed.
He knew where to find the most beautiful scenery and where to find the herbs he needed. He would take small shovels and trowels to dig them up and a bag to put them in. He really loved the countryside and showed us Bluebell Wood and where badgers lived. He knew where to find hazelnuts and truffles. We had a good life here. We did have sirens going off in Hunslet, just as we did at home. But when they did, we went down into the cellar where the coal was kept. We weren't there very long, as it was usually just German planes flying over to bomb some town with docks or railways.
There'll be bluebirds I'll never forget the people I met, braving those angry skies. I remember well as the shadows fell.
In summer, the pits were closed for a fortnight for the miners' annual holiday. And as well as the miners having a holiday, so did the pit ponies. These ponies worked down the mines, pulling coal carts 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 50 weeks of the year. But in August, they were brought up for their holidays. They were brought up with their eyes blindfolded because, having been in the dark for a year, a sudden burst of light would hurt their eyes. They would be taken into a large field where gradually the blindfolds would be taken off. Everyone cheered as the ponies frolicked around the field.
It was quite a celebration for the miners and the children. In the 2 weeks that followed, the children would go every day to see the ponies, taking with them carrots and hay, and really looked after them. On the last day before the ponies were taken back down the pit, it was like a fiesta. The ponies were groomed and the manes were plaited. They put ribbons on them and generally dressed them up. When they were ready, the miners brought out a large cart which was being brightly painted and put the ponies into the shafts. The children then climbed into the carts and they set off around the streets.
The brass band led the procession and played everyone's favourite hymns and tunes that we all knew. My favourite hymn was "O Bread of Heaven." The next day, the ponies would be taken back down the mines to start their next 1 year shift. It was a sad day for miners and children alike because we all loved the ponies and the miners depended on them in their work. Then the bombing in Hull was easing off and the air raids were less frequent, and Mam wanted us to come home. It was 1944 and I was 10 years old. I tried to visualise how it had been before I left, where the streets, shops and houses were before the war. But it was impossible. It was utter devastation and everything was in ruins. As the nights were getting lighter and the air raids lessened, Mam decided to give us a treat and take us to the cinema. Off we went with our torches, tripping over the curbs during the blackout, looking forward to a quiet night out. Unfortunately, the Germans had other ideas and decided to drop a few bombs. If the sirens went off when you were in a cinema or theatre, you had the choice of leaving or staying. Mam said that if we left, it may be difficult to find a shelter as they may be full, so we stayed. The cinema was the Savoy on Holderness Road, near to Woolworths, which we had to pass on our way home.
Woolworths had taken a direct hit. Fortunately, it was empty, so there was nobody hurt. Further down the road, however, was the Elephant and Castle pub, which also had taken a direct hit. This was not so lucky, and I, along with others, dug people out of the ruins and brought out the dead. I spotted the children and tried to warn them to avoid the horrible sight, but it was too late, and they saw bodies laid out on the pavement and the injured with limbs missing.
My brother, like many other boys, had a craze for collecting shrapnel and bullet cases from places where bombs had been dropped. He kept bags of shrapnel and spent bullet cases in the house. It was September 1944 when my mother presented us with a baby brother. My sister and I were pleased, but my other brother was not. He wanted a dog. Our pleasure in our baby brother was increased as we would now be given a green ration book. This was given to any child under 2 and entitled them to extra milk and 2 bananas when the fruit shop had any, which wasn't very often. The christening of my baby brother Brian was to take place at the Mission in Courtney Street, 2 streets away from my house, because the 2 local churches had been bombed out. This upset my mother, but it was how it had to be. The minister could not do the service during the day, so he arranged for a midweek service at 7 p.m. And the sirens went off during the service, so we had to stay until the all clear.
The one good thing that came about because of the war was that it brought us all together. The neighbours helped each other out and they could depend on each other.
Roll out the barrel, we'll have a barrel of fun. Roll out the barrel, we've got the blues on the run. Zing, boom, tararo, ring out a song of good cheer. Now it's time to roll the barrel, for the gang's all here.
Occasionally, I brought rice home from the docks and it was shared with all the children in the neighbourhood. My wife cooked it in a large enamelled bowl in our fire oven.
On the morning of Rice Pudding Day, Mum would send my sister for a little bit of sugar from every household that had children, and I would go to the same households with a jug to collect any extra milk that they could spare. Mum would put the rice, milk and sugar into a mixing bowl and put it in the oven to cook all morning. When we left school at dinner time, all of the children would bring their dishes to our house and queue up for their share of rice pudding. My sister, brother and I would be served last and always worried that Mum had saved enough for us, which she had. These were the only times we had rice pudding, as rice was a rare commodity.
The war ended in 1945 when Jean was 11 years old. We went to Queen's Gardens to see the celebrations. It was strange and wonderful to see the street lights lit up again and the firework display. Everybody was dancing. Some were crying with relief and some were crying with heartache, knowing that their husbands or sons would not be returning after the war. The war with Japan did not end until August 1945. War is a terrible thing. It separates families and disrupts your childhood, but on the whole, we did not do too badly. Our evacuations were good, compared to the fate of some children who were sent to Canada and Australia, many to be mistreated or worked as slaves on the farms.
I hope this has helped you to understand what it was like to be an evacuee living in this part of the country during the Second World War. I consider myself to be lucky to have been in England at this time, because after the war was over, stories of children in Germany and German-occupied countries began to emerge. Jews, gypsies, the disabled, and others who disagreed with the Hitler regime would be rounded up and sent to concentration camps where they were starved, tortured, and murdered. I mention this as my grandma was a Jewess, and had I been living in one of these countries, that could have been my story. And now I pass my story on to you.
My sister's friend Paddy encouraged her to write her story as a child of war. Without her, this would have remained as an untold story. My sister's untold story will be a fitting memorial to the kind, strong person my sister Jean was. It will remind people of the comradeship and support of the people in Hull during the Second World War.
We'll meet again. Don't know where, don't know when, but I know we'll meet again some sunny day.